Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to Gareth Wong in London. I'm Victor Mills. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this webinar, the third in a series looking at ESG. So we considered environmental, or E, risks and responsibilities, and social, or S, risks and responsibilities, in two previous webinars. And in this board series event today, we're now looking at governance, or G. What are the risks and responsibilities? And we all know that without good governance, a company cannot meet its regulatory obligations, and nor can it hope to address and manage ESG risks and responsibilities. This whole series has been made possible thanks to a wonderful collaboration between three chamber member companies, Brunswick Group, Control Risks, and Shearman and Sterling. And I want to thank all the executives from those three member companies for being so willing to share your knowledge, your expertise, and provide your insights to help your fellow members understand and better appreciate ESG and the responsibilities that boards should take on and should practice. So this afternoon, we have in a short while got a keynote address by Mr. Gareth Wong, who's a partner with Shearman and Sterling. And after Gareth has completed his address, he will hand over to our moderator today, who's Pamela Qiu, who is a partner and head of Southeast Asia for Control Risks. And in addition to that, she is also a board director of the Chamber. Pamela will introduce our other distinguished speakers just before the panel conversation commences. And as usual, ladies and gentlemen, please type in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Gareth Wong, partner of Shearman and Sterling, to give his address. He's joining us today from London. Gareth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you to the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce for this opportunity to join all of you in this panel discussion. Having spent 6 years living in Singapore, it's good to be back, at least virtually. So what is the G in ESG? You will recall that in 2018, Elon Musk tweeted about having secured funding to take Tesla private, and that significantly increased the price of Tesla's shares. But then that led to an investigation by the SEC, which eventually resulted in the ouster of Elon Musk as chairman and added a $14 billion fine to its problems. So while environmental issues and social issues in the ESG usually dominate public discussions, it can be easy to overlook the G. However, governance is arguably the most important factor in ESG. So what exactly is governance? In short, governance is about how well a company is run and ensuring that it properly takes into account the interests of its stakeholders. And in practice, governance can encompass a host of structures and processes, including the composition of the board, the management structure of the company, risk management processes, and so on. The G is also intertwined with the E and the S. On the one hand, there are environmental and social considerations within governance, such as the diversity of the board and compliance with environmental legislation. On the other hand, governance also underpins the implementation and oversight of the E and the S. With the growing attention on ESG, regulators and organizations around the world have been trying to keep up and to update their rules and guidelines. And I want to mention 4 notable areas in which governance policies have evolved. The first trend that we see is that there is increasing recognition that corporate decision-making should focus on providing benefits to all stakeholders rather than solely on generating profits for the shareholders. In Singapore, for example, there is a code of corporate governance that applies to all listed companies on a comply or explain basis. The code now refers to sustainability as one of the tenets of good governance, and encourages the boards to consider and manage the needs and interests of different stakeholders, including suppliers, customers, shareholders, as well as society at large. Japan and the United States also have guidelines expressly permitting the boards to engage with stakeholders other than shareholders. The second trend that we see is the heightened requirements on proper management structures. As many of you will probably know, since the beginning of this year, the Singapore Exchange listing rules started requiring that at least a third of the directors on the board of listed companies must be independent directors. Previously, the requirement was there must be at least 2. In addition, the listing rules also provide that the chairman and the CEO of the company should, in principle, be different people. Malaysia also has a corporate governance guide that similarly calls for the separation of the chairman and the CEO. The third trend I would like to mention relating to governance is diversity and inclusion on boards. In Singapore, the Code of Corporate Governance provides that companies should ensure that the boards consist of directors who, as a group, provide an appropriate balance and mix of skills, knowledge, experience, and other aspects of diversity, such as gender and age, so as to avoid groupthink and foster constructive debate. The board's diversity policy and progress made towards implementing those policies will also be disclosed in the company's annual report. For private companies in Singapore, the 2018 revised Code of Corporate Governance also highlighted the need for boards to be sufficiently diverse, although it does not set any concrete criteria. As at January 2022, when I looked at it, women participation on boards at the 100 largest listed companies on SGX amounted to 19.7%, just under 20%. The fourth and the last trend I want to mention is regarding disclosure requirements. More and more stock exchanges are requiring boards to make disclosures relating to the company's sustainability practices. In Singapore, since 2016, the listing rules have required listed companies to prepare annual sustainability reports covering ESG factors and climate-related disclosures. There are also requirements in the listing rules in Hong Kong and Malaysia for companies to make ESG disclosures in their annual reports. So why is governance picking up so much traction? What makes it so important? From the investor's perspective, a company's governance practice is probably the most important factor among the ESG factors when making investment decisions. In a 2018 survey, 91% of investment firms said that among the ESG factors, governance has the greatest impact on investment decisions. And this is perhaps unsurprising, given that there is increasing evidence that suggests that better performance on ESG, especially the G part of it, yields better returns. For example, the 2019 research study found that companies in the top 20% in terms of strong governance outperformed the bottom 20% by 15% over 2 years. And obviously, from the company's own perspective, it should also care about good governance, as it is directly related to how well a company is run, its corporate culture, and its financial growth. Perhaps the best illustration of the importance of good governance is what happens when it fails. And I will mention briefly 3 types of problems when governance fails: commercial and reputational damage, compliance risks, and disputes risks. First, governance failures. Governance failures, when it becomes public knowledge, might result in significant PR problems, which in turn would usually impact the company's business performance and share values. To give perhaps a well-publicized example, recently, last year, a whistleblower in Facebook leaked a series of the so-called Facebook papers, which showed that Facebook put profits before public interest, including its alleged knowingly using algorithms that pushed harmful content onto young users, spreading misinformation, and allegedly even enabling or facilitating human trafficking. In the 6 weeks after the release of the Facebook papers, Facebook's shares were down nearly 13%. Second, bad governance sometimes results in breaches of the applicable rules and legislation, and that subjects the company to serious compliance risks. To give another example, the GSK China scandal, where GSK pleaded guilty to paying bribes to doctors, hospitals, and officials in China to promote its products. As you recall, GSK was punished with an eye-watering $489 million fine by the Chinese authorities, and also had to undergo years of further investigations under the US FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. Furthermore, when there are corruption issues involved, it not only relates to legal compliance, but also commercially adds to the costs of doing business. According to the World Bank, businesses and individuals pay more than $1 trillion in bribes each year, a staggering amount. Corruption internationally therefore adds, it is estimated, at least 10% to the cost of doing business and up to 25% during the procurement phase in developing countries. Lastly, when bad governance causes serious issues for the company, it also subjects the company to lawsuits. I've seen many investment-related disputes in which the investor or the shareholder alleges mismanagement of the company, including, for example, issuing misleading reports to shareholders. I've seen numerous allegations of lack of control for related party transactions and lack of independent auditing. And I've seen many examples, sadly, of allegations in lawsuits that a winner of a procurement or an auction bid only won by reasons of bribes. Corruption allegations are also very commonly raised in litigation and arbitration proceedings, where a party seeks to impugn the validity of a contract or the basis of an investment. Corruption claims can often have very serious consequences. In some jurisdictions, for example, in the UK, Australia, and the US, directors can be held personally liable if they turn a blind eye to the corruption offense. So with these introductory words, I hope I've set the scene for what should be a very interesting and engaging panel discussion where we can delve more deeply into some of these topics and beyond. And with that, thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and welcome everyone to the panel portion of our meeting today. My name is Pamela Qiu. I am a partner and head of Southeast Asia for Control Risks. I am delighted to be here. And I would like to invite my fellow panelists to also come online on video. May I invite Ms. Prue Bennett. Prue is a partner for Brunswick Group. She joined Brunswick in 2014 after a career at BlackRock, where she was managing director and head of stewardship for the APAC region. She has been an active participant in the public debate on corporate governance. So welcome, Prue. Next, I'd like to introduce Steve. Steve is my colleague here in Control Risks, and Steve is a partner and head of our global advisory group. He leads a team of specialists looking at country, sector, and regulatory analysis. And he has a very, very strong history with the Asia region, having been here nearly 2 decades. He has set up the India office for control risks, really established the presence for control risks here in Southeast Asia as well. And then last but not least, of course, we know Gareth, who's just given us a really fantastic overview. Gareth, to repeat that he's a partner at SG Sterling. And thank you very much, Gareth, for those opening remarks, which has really set the foundation for us to continue our conversation here. I wanted to step back after a lot of that great detail you offered us, and to begin with Prue to ask a pretty basic question, which is the role of G in the ESG term. And Gareth mentioned a little bit there about how G is really, really critical to the success of E and S. I wanted to ask your opinion. Do you think that the G is the most important of the ESG? Why not? Are they equal weight? Perhaps, Prue, you could begin with your sentiments on that.
Thanks, Pamela, and thanks to the Chamber for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a pleasure. I certainly agree that the G is the most important of ESG. And I remember in the early 2000s, because just by way of background, I have been very focused on the G since the mid-1990s when I became a partner in a proxy advisory firm. So we were always focused on the G. And in the early 2000s, this acronym ESG started to appear. And I said, what does this stand for? Oh, environmental, social and governance issues. And I did question why the G was on the end, because I've always thought that the G has been the most important. And to explain that, if you take the board and you'd expect the expectations, and my prior role as an investor is for the board to firstly comprise competent people and have a diversity of skills and experience, and in particular amongst the independent directors, core industry skills. So if it's a mining company, you'd expect to see at least one independent director with a mining background, or if it's a property company, an independent director with some property skills. So amongst the independent directors, and so that board would then, a competent board would understand what the company is exposed to from an environmental and social risk perspective, and therefore provide better oversight of management of those risks, as opposed to an incompetent board that lacks that skills and experience, doesn't have that diversity of skills and thinking. They're not going to really understand what the company is exposed to from an E&S perspective. So that's why I think G is definitely the most important of the ESG. But it's also important for boards, I think, to use those skills and experience matrices, that result in better outcomes of board structure, good succession planning to ensure that new blood is brought onto board, as well as maintaining corporate knowledge, and also to understand that this isn't a compliance issue. This is a strategic issue to get quality directors who can challenge management in a constructive way around their role, which is to implement strategy. But I guess I'll just finish this question by just saying that good G doesn't necessarily mean good performance. There are lots of companies out there which have got very bad G that tend to outperform. They tend to have more volatile share prices, but you rarely see, if ever, a well-governed company with a really competent board losing significant shareholder value.
Thanks very much, Prue. And I'd like to return to some of these questions around governance and the link to performance. So thank you for prompting that. But I'd love to pass to Steve as well to sort of share with us his introductory remarks. And maybe if I could come to Steve with sort of this angle where, governance is something that is quite, I would say, it's a really soft topic in the news, at least. When you look at environmental, the media, the companies, public attention has been placed on, reducing carbon credits, really tangible things that companies can aspire or aim towards. And then on the social side, companies hate to be in the news around anything related to a social crisis, to their workforce or their labor supply chains. So they really try to do as much as they can to avoid that kind of crisis. When it comes to governance, though, I feel like it's quite neglected compared to what Prue has said is really, really important. So how do you think about governance in the way it's operationalized? Prue mentioned good succession planning. Perhaps that's something that could be operationalized. But Steve, how do you think about operationalizing a good governance strategy? How should boards be thinking about that? What should they be aiming for?
Wow. Okay. I'll start with another Elon Musk quote, and that is ESG is a scam. That was one of his more recent ones, I think, from a few weeks ago that he put on Twitter. And I don't know whether there was a degree of slight sour grapes in that comment. And I think it was in reference to Tesla being marked down against a number of more perceived polluting companies. And I suspect that what annoyed Elon was being marked down on the governance side of things. It was governance that got him. Just to sort of follow on from what Prue was saying, you know, if you want to have a starting point in terms of sort of measuring the quality of governance in companies, just look at who the guardians of the company's governance are in terms of their quality, their diversity, etc. And then ask them very, you know, in the form of their, not just their statutory reporting, but actually get them to account for themselves in the way they structure their governance and what kind of roadmap they have for improving it. And I think if you look across the quality of companies, you know, the ones that really do have the better governance are the ones who are actually relatively outspoken in where their governance weaknesses lie, and are quite frank about the work that they have to do in improving it. And the other factor of quality that I've seen over the years at looking at companies is just the amount of detail that they put into the reporting on the governance of their companies, so that you actually have something to measure against. I'm always slightly suspicious of companies that just do enough in terms of their reporting requirements, rather than going into rather more detail, so that outsiders can then make their own assessment. And I think that would be the third thing. I mean, I've sort of cut my career teeth as an investigator, and it's the old story of, you know, buyer beware, trust, but also verify. And of course, if companies are producing as a lot of information about themselves and about their self-perception of the quality of their governance, you can then take that and either verify that they're actually pretty much where they claim they are in terms of their governance, or you refute it and you find out where the lies and the fraud and the cheating lies. Just to bring it, sorry, I won't go on too much longer, but I mean, to bring it back around to the sort of ESG debate, I think as we know, everybody on this call knows that the debate is really getting quite red hot, and it's getting very, very interesting, and it's getting, you know, we're really getting into quite disputed territory. And whilst the regulators are catching up in the great ESG scramble, a lot of it is still down to corporate governance and the quality of controls that companies choose, are not required to, but choose to impose on themselves in the realm of ESG. And I think the importance of that is only going to increase.
Thanks very much, Steve. And I think we'll return to sort of the trajectory of the ESG journey with companies and how that's progressing towards the later part of this conversation. If I could turn to Gareth and maybe dig a little bit deeper with what Prue and Steve have also said, but with the examples that you highlighted in your keynote. You mentioned at the outset Tesla and Elon Musk, and then later as well Meta. When I think these two companies are founded by really, really charismatic CEOs, founders of these companies, built them into almost like empires, and to this day still find it difficult to loosen up their hold on the company. So I was, in the course of sort of thinking about this conversation, I also went to dig up some MSCI reports, and they produce these ESG rating reports, and they have the E and the S and the G, and I looked at the G, and the concerns that came up for a company like Tesla was that they still had an entrenched board, despite the example that you mentioned. You finally kicked Elon off, but they still have an entrenched board. They highlighted the lack of diversity. For Meta, the concerns were that privacy, content, antitrust concerns were still falling very heavily on the shoulders of the senior leadership team, of which Elon Musk has a 60% majority voting control over. And I think the question, though, is how did these companies still get such a strong trajectory of growth till this day, if you look at the valuations of companies, you see Meta, you'll see Tesla on their stock market performance. And coming back to Pru's point, what is the link between good governance and strong investor confidence and strong investor input into that growth story? So if I could then ask you to comment on that, and then go one step further to say, what should investors be asking of these companies when they push for better governance, if they think they should push for governance? And if you relate to Asia as well, we don't have maybe not the Teslas and the Metas of the world, but a lot of these similar structures come up in Asian conglomerates, right? So what should investors be asking companies which is so dominated by a charismatic CEO?
Those are very good questions, Pamela. I think good structures and good policies encourage better results and better outcomes. In themselves, they are not sufficient, but they definitely help the eventual result. They result, we hope, in better overall decision making. And you mentioned companies with incredibly charismatic and perhaps even very controlling founders. As you mentioned, these individuals have still very large stakes, respectively, very large stakes and significant control over the companies that they founded. That in itself is fine. That in itself can encourage good stock market performance. For example, if the decisions that they are making are the correct ones. But the point of having good governance structures, for example, having diversity on the board, is that it helps encourage better decision making overall. The reason for it, or one of the reasons for it, is that it discourages groupthink. If you have a diversity of viewpoints, perspectives on the board, where you have people who come from different backgrounds, perhaps women, men, people from different racial backgrounds, different nationalities, they bring that diversity, the wealth of their lived experience, to decision making on the board, and therefore it discourages a sort of echo chamber where perhaps they have the same people on the board saying the same things because they come all from the same educational and cultural background. So I think coming back to the point that I started with, I think having good structures in place helps encourage better decision making. It's not a panacea. It's not the one thing that is definitely going to result in a company's good performance.
Thanks very much, Gareth. I think that's very helpful to be highlighting that. Perhaps if I could turn to Pru to continue your thought around what good governance might mean for performance of companies or not.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Gareth's comment. And it's interesting at the moment while we're going through a tech wreck, and we've lost, look at some of the tech companies and how much value that they've lost just this year to date. It'll be interesting when the researchers get hold of that value and do an assessment of G of those companies. And my hypothesis would be those companies with good G have lost less value than those with poor G. And that goes back to the point I made earlier that poor G doesn't necessarily mean poor performance. And there are some we look at Meta, we look at Tesla, and a number of well-performing companies have combined CEO, yet we've got corporate governance codes that say they should be separated. A good example of that is BlackRock, where I used to work, and as an investor, I would engage with companies, and our policies actually said separation of the role of CEO and chairman. But Larry Fink was a founder, and he's been in that role ever since day one. So to split that role of an incumbent chair CEO is not going to work, and there have been examples where shareholder pressure have resulted in the role being split. So then you've got the former combined chair CEO either becomes chairman or CEO, and you have another person goes into the role of either chair or CEO, and the dynamics doesn't work. So what we would ask companies with the founder situation, and it's quite clear what BlackRock would do, that as part of the succession planning of the founder, that then the role is split. So you then get an independent chairman and you get a separate CEO. And that's a much more logical way to manage that transition. So there was an acceptance as an investor for a founder in the combined role, but it wasn't to continue as that founder stepped away and stepped off the board. The other issue that we're seeing around the, companies, and there was the comment that Gareth made around control, that there's also a disconnect between control and ownership, because a lot of these companies have dual class shares or weighted voting rights. So they've got this control, but not necessarily aligned with the ownership. And from an investor perspective, that's quite a poor structure. But there's also, if you look in the US, a number of increase in shareholder proposals, which are around governance. They're around issues around pay equity, around racial equity, inequality, and what these policies are, and really asking for more transparency around some of these E&S issues. And it's really incumbent upon the board to be more transparent around the policies and their approach on these very critical societal issues that can impact customers and sales, etc. While companies, and I think boards, should take a multi-stakeholder approach in how they manage things, I also believe that in terms of shareholder primacy, the board has one master, which is shareholders, but they can't deliver long-term returns for their shareholders without taking that multi-stakeholder approach. As I said, in the US, the number of shareholder proposals is increasing significantly, and we're just about to research that from the recently finished Northern Hemisphere proxy season. So it's very much top of mind of shareholders, and there are a lot of activist investors, there are a lot of social investors out there focused on these issues. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the board and the board's responsibility for its oversight of these issues and how it communicates to not just shareholders, but broader community and other stakeholders.
Thanks very much, Prue. And I think I'll return to you as well around the board and the call for action to boards in Asia. But I also see questions in the chat, very interesting questions in the chat, and I would like to come to that soon. Just before I do that, if I could reopen with Steve and take some of these ideas that we've talked about and go again from a different angle. We talked about the challenges of moving from a founder CEO startup to a larger organization, and the need then to build in certain types of governance structures that would help them become better companies. But I know that, Steve, you advise a lot of our clients around how do you even start thinking about this putting in place of a governance structure. If a company is coming with almost nothing, given that they're starting small, how do they then think about what are the principles that they need to be thinking about as they try to formulate or plan out a good governance structure? What do they start with? Steve, if you could share a bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us who've been involved in startups, governance is not front and center of mind when you're thinking about hitting the marketplace, and it's to a certain extent an evolution. It's also, as Gareth mentioned right at the beginning, an imposition to a relatively minor extent, actually, by the law and by regulators. But I think companies, it is all about, I think, a corporate sense of self-awareness. So the more successful companies that I've looked at over the years that are relatively new and relatively small in their lifespan have been very aware of what the competition has been up to in terms of governance. And I mean that in a positive sense, not sort of carrying out corporate espionage. They're actually sort of trying to work out where they are in the pantheon of governance risk, and just how far off best in show they actually are, and whether they can fold that into their value proposition, and so on and so forth. So the companies that really are the most successful have that constant awareness of just where they are on that scale, and try to maintain that themselves, if not actually at the top of it, then very close to it. And just that benchmarking of best practices is actually really effective way to just make sure that your governance standards are really up to scratch. And also honesty, as well as self-awareness. I think quite a high degree of honesty about the predicament of your business. I mean, one of the things I have to spend so much time dealing with is actually feuds within companies that have, in a very cozy office in Stockholm, come up with a governance structure that they want to roll out globally, and it completely ignores the nuanced challenges, difficulties of operationalizing that governance structure in, I'm not going to be cruel about anywhere in particular, but say Indonesia, for example, and just the dissonance between the headquarters and the country operation can sometimes be really quite debilitating. So companies that have very strong governance structures are also constantly examining whether they're fit for purpose, really genuinely fit for purpose in the markets where all the markets where they operate, and not just some imagined space around HQ.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because a lot of the words I picked up from your comments, Steve, are nothing to do with compliance. And Gareth mentioned that as well in his keynote, that a governance program is not about compliance. But as many HQs try to roll out programs, they definitely have compliance in mind, right? They want to make sure that they don't get into some legal troubles as they're heading into a new market. But can you share a little bit about the need for compliance, but then the other things that must come along with that? So you mentioned self-awareness, or sort of the relationships that you have across the teams. What are those principles to help you think about a governance program?
Yeah, it's funny actually that none of us really have sort of mentioned compliance sort of first and foremost. I mean, I actually run a sub team in control risks, and it's called the Governance, Ethics and Compliance Group, and I would attach the relative importance of those things in that order. I mean, with compliance, inherent in the term itself is doing enough to be correct, if you like. Whereas governance is, as both Gareth and Prue said earlier, is the thing that really holds the whole roof of the corporate structure up. If you don't have the sort of command and controls around the well-being of the company really being effectively administered, then compliance is just a piece of paper. Execution of it is almost insignificant. So yes, having a very strong compliance function is a vital component of corporate governance. But I think unless you overlay that with a really strong dollop of ethics as well, so the whole culture of the company is actually mobilized in a much more proactive way, rather than just good enough, rather than just comply, I think the quality of your governance really suffers. So that's quite an integral part as well.
Thanks.
And could I just, Pamela, if I may, could I just follow up with a couple of comments on that, with which I totally agree. I mean, I think governance has at least two elements. There are many ways to look at it, but I think it has two elements. I think at its it has one element is this, that it's at a minimum proper compliance with policies and legislation, and avoiding bad decisions. So it's if you like, avoiding bad things happening, avoiding being non-compliant with legislation, avoiding bad decisions. The other element is encouraging better decision-making. That's the upside, encouraging better decision-making that increases the value of the company overall in the long term, as Prue mentioned. But coming back to the first element that I described, ensuring proper compliance and avoiding bad decisions. I agree with Steve. I think overall that element of governance tends to be underappreciated by companies. Very often company shareholders see the compliance department perhaps as being a cost center. It's something that has to be done. But I think very much like electricity, it's something that people take for granted and people only notice when it's not there. When things go wrong, people notice. And I think it needs to be understood that governance includes this element of compliance and discouraging bad decision making, which is absolutely essential ultimately for delivering the long-term value that Prue mentioned.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add to that as well. When I first moved to Asia and was engaging with company boards around governance, I was promptly told, oh, that's the compliance department. And so there was really no issue. Now, McKinsey has been researching governance and the premium that institutional investors will pay for well-governed companies for over 20 years. And the last research showed that it was a median of 10%. So if you can get an extra 10% in market cap by communicating good governance, that's a cost of capital issue, that's a financial issue, that's a really strategic issue. And I think it really demonstrates the importance of it being beyond compliance.
Yes, agree. Thanks very much, Prue. I would like to turn to the chat and the questions and answers from the audience. They're currently contributed by Victor. And I will encourage other people on the line to please do share your comments or questions in the chat box, and we will definitely want to discuss them here. Victor asks, does the panel agree the war in Ukraine is an incredible challenge for the world of ESG? I ask that question all the time as well. You know, we talk to our clients around the need to reduce their carbon footprint and the need to move away from oil and gas. And the conflict in Ukraine has caused some countries to go a bit longer on that journey because they've had cut off from their energy supplies from Russia. And they need to sort of go back to using sometimes coal-fired power plants or gas, which, although is better than some other forms, is not renewable. Steve, I know we talk a lot about this. Maybe if I could ask you to begin around this I guess dilemma with how the Ukraine war has posed to the world, to the way we should be thinking about ESG.
Yeah, okay. Interesting question. I mean, obviously the war in Ukraine is very much a disaster in its own right, period. But in terms of ESG, I mean, my glib answer would be short-term disaster, but probably long-term shot in the arm in terms of moving away from energy derived from carbon. I think, unfortunately, the Ukraine conflict has also been a massive distraction. I mean, the arc of history was looking like COP26 conference, very frightened heads of state go back home and go, oh my goodness, how are we really going to get to grips, particularly, you know, with our carbon commitments? How are we going to impose that on the business community to essentially deflect some of the lost political capital from dithering on climate change for so long? And then that arc of concern has almost been put to one side whilst everybody's been dealing with the immediate disaster of the war in Ukraine itself. I think that's finally, that's starting to change, as we've seen in the headlines most recently, and governments are starting to get back on track with a more tangible climate agenda, but it has slowed things down. So that's my, I guess, my brief answer.
Thanks, Steve. Prue, Gareth, do you want to comment?
Yes, I think initially it's a G issue. How well informed is the board around what's happening in Ukraine and the potential impact on the company's strategy? There are not many geopolitical experts on boards that I see, and I'm not suggesting that all boards should have a geopolitical expert as a member of the board. And so what we're doing with our clients is, first of all, sending out regular updates about what's happening and potential implications. And for some clients where it is a it will have implications on strategy, and strategy may need to change, is very specific advice around the geopolitical implications for that company. So if I was sitting on a board, I'd want to know what are the implications for my company and how do we inform the board of those geopolitical implications. And geopolitical implications come up all the time. Ukraine is just an example. And it comes back to having an informed board, having a competent board, and having the processes in place to ensure that information is communicated and understood by the board. And on Steve's point, in terms of energy transition, it's obviously a hiccup, for want of a better word, in the transition to a lower carbon economy. But I've been speaking to many investors lately, and in particular those who are signatories to Climate Action 100+. It will not take the investor community's eye off the transition at all. So if there are any companies out there thinking, oh, this is great, we don't have to worry about our transition, we don't have to worry about saying we're going to be net zero by 2050 or 30-40% reduction by 2030, my advice would be to strongly think again. You need to communicate around how this is going to impact your plan and make sure you've got clarity around the plan and the roadmap to achieve whatever commitments you have made.
Thanks very much, Prue. Gareth, you came off mute. Would you like to add?
Just a very few words. I totally agree with the comments of Steve and Prue. It's a short-term hurdle, but I think in the longer term, as Prue says, all companies are very focused, and most companies are very focused on ensuring lower carbon emissions. I think what the Ukraine war has highlighted, amongst many other things, is the over-dependence of certain companies, certain regions on a few sources of energy, in this case, most particularly Russia. What I think we're going to, in the short term, I think what we're going to see is short-term fixes, things like a ramp-up probably of electricity generated from coal and other polluting sources. However, I think in the longer term, we are going to see two things. One, a renewed, reinvigorated investment in terms of renewable energy, but also a renewed focus on diversification of energy sources. Because I think companies are going to be thinking, good companies with good governance structures are going to be thinking about the situation before the war, where perhaps they were overly dependent on gas and oil from Russia, and thinking, look, if we change our strategy now in the future so that we are now much more dependent on coal from a few countries, are we just trading one risk for another risk? Whereas if we start thinking as a company about things like getting energy from renewables and others, solar and wind, for example, we as a company are able to diversify the sources of our energy and therefore diversify or hedge our risk in the event that something, some other unanticipated event happens again in the future.
Thanks very much, Gareth. And I like the way this panel thinks. It's the crisis that has gone on does not detract us from the larger picture here. And to use words, it's giving a short-term pain but a shot in the arm. Because the next question from Victor is also a little bit downbeat, where he asks whether or not what does the panel think of the view of some commentators who suggest the term ESG now means all things to all people and might be nearing retirement. It's an extension of the question earlier, kind of that was answered, and I hear very clearly from our panel that no, all companies, stakeholders are going to be very still convinced and committed to especially the zero carbon goals. But perhaps if I could press that point, just as Victor did, I start with Steve, because we talked about this as well, of the risks involved for companies on going with a ESG, I guess a big ESG announcements or programs, initiatives that we see a lot of companies are making. If you go to any Fortune 500 company and you click on their website, you see a sustainability page, and in that sustainability page, there are all of these goals in 2050 quite often, which has gained some skepticism that some of these goals might not be reached, or companies do not have the plan to reach there. And we've heard about the risks of backlash or greenwashing. Steve, how do you think about that, the risks of an ESG program, and then the opportunities around it?
Yeah, well, I already mentioned Elon thinks it's a scam now, but quite a lot of more cerebral people have also drawn attention to some of the flaws, particularly in the area of ESG investing and using ESG measurement criteria as a form of valuation. I think that area of the ESG land is in a little bit of trouble because it's been way too under-regulated and it's relied way too much on corporate self-reporting, and there's a lot of dispute over standards, both by various groupings that hold those standards and by country jurisdictions. It's a bit of a mess, in short, but I don't think that should detract. And as has already been, as I think it was Prue or already mentioned, even a war in Ukraine is not distracting companies with a good governance and a degree of self-awareness from their environmental, social, and governance objectives. And I think that's absolutely very true. The danger that you infer is of course the number of companies that actually lie about those objectives or misrepresent those objectives, and the regulators are scrambling to sort of catch up and impose a higher degree of transparency on that. And companies like ours at PAM, we're obviously very, very busy in trying to verify or expose that misrepresentation. So I would just say, there's a lot of companies out there with a lot of goodwill, genuine goodwill, genuine ethics, that have overreached somewhat in terms of their commitment, particularly to the E part of ES and S and G, and they're in danger of having their reputations damaged as people start to query some of the commitments they've made, some of the timelines that they are proposing for carbon neutrality, things like that. I think there is definitely a danger there. So I would advise companies, and I do advise companies who have a commitment to ES and G, is make sure what you're going to publicize is absolutely achievable. Make sure you're good for it. Don't make it up. Don't use ESG as a publicity stunt. Make sure it's a genuine commitment, because that over time will lock in the value. There's no doubt about that.
Thanks, Steve. And just to highlight, this has been drummed into me since the start of this year, because in fact, for control risk, top risk for 2020, there are 6 of them. One of them is exactly this: the reputational damage that could be done if you don't report accurately, or you lie about your commitments to certain ESG goals. It could come back with a vengeance for that. Just wondering if Prue, Gareth, would you like to continue and add some more comments on that?
Yeah, sure. I certainly don't see ESG retiring soon. And I think there's some research that was undertaken by Ocean Tomo over the last 45 years. In 1975, it showed for S&P 500 companies, 73% of the market cap was represented by tangible assets. So that's financial assets and manufactured assets, and 17% intangible. And that research has been replicated over the last 45 years. The last research released in 2020, it's completely reversed, with 10% being tangible and 90% being intangible. So what's represented by that intangible value of the market cap? It's human capital, it's social capital, it's environmental capital, and it's intellectual capital. And so those capitals, if they're not managed well, that's where you'll have value destruction, and you have the opportunity for value creation. And this is where a lot of companies don't get it. And this is where those companies that see it as a compliance issue or a nice to have aren't looking at the opportunities for value creation. It's a really important thing, and what investors are looking for. And this is why over the last 10, 15 years, investors have been more and more focused on these, I'll use the term non-financial, but these issues, if managed well, have a positive financial outcome, and if not managed well, can have a negative financial outcome. And this is why we have seen this huge growth in investor interest on these issues because of the impact on financials. But coming back to the point that Steve was talking about initially on funds, the SEC only 2 weeks ago rated Goldman's for greenwashing on the name of the funds. And I've seen lots of decks when I go to conferences saying, look at all this inflow of money into ESG funds. And it's a line that's just going up exponentially. And I just shake my head every time I see it. It's not fund inflows. It's just those funds that have changed their name and put ESG in the title. And there's a lot of this going on. And there's a lot of greenwashing in terms of the corporate side. And it is being picked up. Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a group of investors representing over $100 trillion in assets under management, did a survey of those, the companies that they cover, which is about 160, who have made net zero by 2050 commitments, and how many had roadmaps. And it was a very small percentage. And so, again, coming back to what Steve said, if you're going to make a commitment, you need to have a roadmap, you need to have targets, and you need to report on a regular basis to those, to the metrics that lead up to the targets. And it is a challenge because if you're talking about climate change and emissions reductions, it's not a straight line. And in fact, between now and 2030, your emissions may go up. And it's really challenging to get to be able to articulate that to your shareholders and other stakeholders. So the whole communication aspect of ESG has really stepped up. You know, the bar has really raised because this is what investors are focused on, and broader society are also interested in what companies are doing. And it's a real challenge to get that communication right. And for the commitments to 2050, you know, it's not so bad to 2030, but often, and clients we're working with, from 2030 to 2050, it's reliant on technologies that don't exist. Like carbon capture and storage, yes, it exists, but it's not scalable enough to provide the solutions that we need. And it is part of the IEA's reports that if we are going to get to 1.5, carbon capture and storage has to be part of that. It's not part of that yet. So communicating that you're in part of your net zero by 2050 plan incorporates technology that really doesn't operate is again a challenge. And it's also and Gareth, it's a legal challenge as well. And there's direct air capture, there's all of these technologies where significant investment is going in, but are they going to work? It's still a bit of an unknown. Hydrogen is still an unknown in terms of its timeline. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? It's an absolute challenge to communicate that in an effective way to stakeholders.
Thanks very much, Prue. Gareth, did you want to share anything?
Just very briefly, I mean, I agree with one of the sentiments, which is at least that ESG is such a broad umbrella that it can mean all things to all people, many things to many different people who are obviously self-interested in promoting a particular aspect, perhaps of E, S, or G. But I think ESG is now, as Prue says, very firmly on the agenda. It's not going to go away. And yes, there are going to be examples of, and unfortunately, I think in the future, many examples of greenwashing. There are going to be many examples of tokenism, but that doesn't detract from the fundamental good that ESG achieves. I think fundamentally, the reason why it resonates so deeply with so many stakeholders and so many companies around the world is this. Firstly, it encapsulates perhaps what stakeholders, shareholders, regulators feel are good ethics, good morals. There is something in ESG which resonates fundamentally with what with them, or us. And then secondly, I think the reason why ESG isn't going to, is so widespread now, and it's not going to go away, is that everybody understands that in the long term, it is about encouraging long-term value, long-term growth to a company. So in the end, it's going to benefit the company as well as the stakeholders.
Very good point. I would like to invite all our participants online to keep on generating some thoughts and questions, comments in the chat box. We have another one by Korean Ong. Are there good governance frameworks to guide in decision making? I think there's the question there is self-explanatory. If I could start perhaps with Steve.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as Gareth mentioned at the beginning, there's, you know, in the various jurisdictions where we operate, governments and regulators offer up various sets of criteria and governance frameworks and expectations as a kind of baseline ask. And then, as I think I mentioned, corporates that really do governance well tend to build on that by looking very hard over their shoulder at what companies, sectors, boards like them are doing in terms of best practice.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I agree with that. There are a number of structures around there, but you can't rely on the structure itself. As I said, you need competent directors. You need that diversity of mix and skills and experience. And as Gareth said, you know, mentioned about the group think. You need a culture of continual improvement on the board. I think the best boards I've worked with have this idea. You know, we're not doing everything the same every year. How can we change the information that's coming through to us to drive our decisions? So this culture of continual improvement. And I think that just lastly, I mean, you could go on with lots of issues here, but I think another important issue is keeping the board informed on critical issues. Ukraine and geopolitical is one example. I think a lot of boards don't really understand the implications of climate change and transition and how it may impact their company. And they can't just rely on management for that information. They need to seek that advice independently. So you can have the framework there, but unless you've got that culture of continuous improvement, that culture to continue learning, particularly about critical issues that could impact the company, you know, the framework on its own isn't going to provide that solution.
Yeah, I mean, the diversity of boards that we've looked at over the years is quite astonishing in terms of. I mean, there's a real typology from the sort of best in show, very diverse, very experienced, and full of people who've made a lot of mistakes during their careers.
Absolutely, yes. Often make the best directors.
They do indeed. And yeah, over the years I've done training with board members, and it's been like a group of grumpy kids sat at the back of the class. And alternatively, I've had some really quite eminent sort of former president directors of major companies sat in the room going, "This is really interesting. We need to learn more about this." So that there is a real spread still.
Thanks very much. And Corinne mentioned that's great. She's enjoyed those comments and well said to all of you here. And I think just to summarize the answer, it starts with the board. It starts from the top. They promote the incentives and the culture of the CEO's team. And then that kind of cascades down to what's needed to be done or changed within the organization. So it really starts from the board. If I could twist that though and turn the question around, bringing in some of the statistics that Gareth mentioned. In Singapore, only less than 20% of all board seats that go to women, and that's very rude kind of generalization about diversity. It's just on gender. If you dig deeper, I will be very surprised if I don't see even more lack of diversity when it comes to backgrounds and different types of I guess personalities on the board. And so if we start with the board being not ideal in its composition, and that in itself is one of the metrics for good governance, then we're starting from a difficult position. What are the levers, or what can the CEO, senior management do to start questioning their board's competence? Is there any role for that, where your boards they don't get I guess annual review like the CEO does, or all of us do? Nobody sort of sits with them with a pen and say, did you fulfill these responsibilities as a board member? What are the things that we can make to make sure that the board is accountable, make sure that the board is responsible, and having new ideas to the table every year? Because we see the same old faces, as I was talking about, I guess the one I know best, Singapore, right? It's the same people rotating around the different boards. They bring the same ideas, and so nothing really changes. Prue, do you want to share a bit about how we could change that?
Sure. Well, it'd be a pretty gutsy management team that went to the board and wanted to have a discussion about their lack of competency, but I think that'd be a good one. But look, the problem with Asia is the boards, companies are dominated by block shareholders, and either state or family. When you look at jurisdictions like Australia or the UK or the US, that's not generally the case. I think it's around 70% in Asia of Asian companies listed companies have a block shareholder. So that means that institutional shareholders have less of a say on voting issues. Now, I've been involved in the gender diversity on boards debate in Australia since 2010, and also in Hong Kong. In 2010, the percentage of women on board in both jurisdictions was about the same. It was about 9 or 10%. Australia now has about 33% in the ASX 200. Hong Kong's gone from about 9 or 10% to about 14%. That hasn't moved. The big influencer in Australia was the institutional investor, because they were threatening to vote against the re-election of the chair of the nomination committee, where there are no women. Now they're looking at voting against the chair of the nomination committee if there are less than 3 women. And they have a very big voting bloc. In Hong Kong, and it's the same in Singapore, they don't have that power. And in my discussions with boards, they don't even look at the proxy voting stats to realise that the majority of minority shareholders have actually voted against all of the directors who are up for re-election. So I've been pushing in Hong Kong for that to be separate and public disclosure. You can sit down and work it out, but it's quite often the case, and there are a number of other proposals, which I won't go into here, where that is the case, where the block shareholder has voted, so it's gone through, but the minority shareholders, the majority of whom have voted against, aren't even listened to. So, and again, the board is accountable to shareholders. And when you've got the block shareholder, that tends to be the shareholder that the board is accountable to, and not the other shareholders that make up the minority ownership. So it's until boards sort of really realise, or there's more transparency, I think, around the voting process, and boards have got to justify why they have or have not taken an action when there isn't that majority support from minority shareholders, that I think things will change and we will see improvement. And I believe that the lack of gender diversity on Singapore boards is a reflection of poor succession planning. I mean, it has improved and it's done a better job than Hong Kong in improving. But again, that succession planning should see new blood coming onto the board, maintaining corporate memory. And I'd also like to see an increased number of independent directors. Having three directors on there, they all tend to be the audit committee, the nomination committee, and the remuneration committee. So you get a majority of independents on each of those committees. So it is a challenge in Asian jurisdictions because of that ownership structure.
Thanks very much, Prue. It's great to know. Gareth, anything to add to that?
Just very briefly, I think as you mentioned, one way of encouraging diversity in the board is to impose blunt requirements. For example, 30%, 40% of the board has to be female. I think that there is considerable debate about whether that's the right thing to do. Certainly, some countries have done it, others have not. But I think and those sort of blunt mandatory requirements can really just apply to certain ascertainable characteristics, if you like. But what we really want, of course, on the board is a diversity of views, not just blunt characteristics like race or gender, but different backgrounds, perhaps, and different lived experiences, as I say. I think the better but longer term way of encouraging more diversity and ultimately better decision making on boards is encouragement, education and encouragement to boards to do so. I'm not necessarily a fan of external mandatory requirements being imposed on boards. I think it's too blunt an instrument.
Thanks very much. Steve, did you want to add anything?
Oh, I was quite interested to read about your old boss, Prue, Larry Fink, saying that I'm not quite sure the way it was reported, it was quite difficult to discern what he was really saying, but what it seemed to me he was saying was, we're going to tone down the shareholder proposals that are just lasering in on environmental issues, and we're going to really focus on the proposals that surround governance, because we believe that it is actually the governance structures of companies that should then pick up and run with the E and the S. I think that's yeah. That's what was roughly said. I think that's really interesting, and there's still shareholder activism is I think an important component to this and to improving the quality of governance inside companies. And I think it's a rather sensible strategy to actually focus in on governance, and then the governance then starts to solve the other issues surrounding ESG. So the more competent, more diverse boards, and if shareholders can have a role in focusing in on improving the quality of governance first and foremost, then other good things will follow.
Yep, great. We're approaching the end of our time. I have one last question for the panelists from my side. I'll maybe summarize some of my thoughts from the discussion today, and then move to the question and hand over back to Victor, who will close us off. The comments I've written down is that from this conversation, I've taken away that governance significantly helps companies make better decisions, but it's not for sure that good governance will mean that you have a stellar performance, at least not stellar performance in terms of stock market performance or revenues growth, at least in the short term. So Gareth mentioned later on there, in the long term, we're quite convinced that it will play out, and that governance is not about compliance. It's really about good ethics, responsibilities for businesses that they know that they must take as the responsible stakeholders of our environment and our society. And that ESG, despite some of the detractors or the ones that are less positive about the trajectory, the panel here strongly thinks that it's not in retirement, although you must bear in mind some of the reputational risks or the greenwashing risks that you might face. So please, have that roadmap, set those targets, report regularly, and be honest in those reportings. Also heard that the competence of the board is key. The diversity of the board is key. And to bring it back to Steve's last comment that Larry, I think we should bear some thought to what he does say. So he did say that governance is really the most important thing. So with that, I think I took out the main points of our conversation. I'm sure there were many more. Later on, if our panel wants to add an emphasis on anything I've missed, please do. But my last question to each of you is really, what do you think the call of action here is for the audience, which many of them are sitting on boards, many of them are advising companies to sit on boards, advising companies on their governance programs. Some of them are CEOs. What do you think your call to action is for them as they're listening to that? If I could start with Prue.
Sure. I think to be informed on those business critical issues that are likely to impact reputation, which is in turn is going to impact, valuation and potentially negative implications. But that can also be looked at in the reverse of those critical issues about how that they can be viewed as opportunities to also impact positively on reputation, enhance reputation, and also, again, a positive financial impact. But be informed, if you're on board, be able to challenge management in a constructive way to lead to better decisions. And I think that's been a common theme of what we've been talking about today. This is all about leading to better decision making.
Thanks very much, Prue. That's great. Anything to add that I've missed perhaps in my summary that you wanted to highlight?
No, you did a great job.
Thanks very much. Gareth, if I could come to you.
I think the call to action that is something that I mentioned before. My plea to companies and boards is not to regard compliance and good governance as a tick box exercise. Compliance departments are not cost centers. They're ultimately contributing to the growth of the company and should be regarded as such.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Very clear call to action there. Steve, if you have the honor of closing this question. Okay,
and thank you for the honor. I'll go back to what Gareth said right at the beginning, which is, good corporate governance is all about the effective management of risks and responsibilities. And as Gareth just inferred, it's not about making boring, unimaginative companies. It's about really having the structures in place to be very effective and profitable. And I would just finish off with, good corporate governance can become a real value proposition in its own right. I know when we discuss this, we're tending to think about mega public companies, but a lot of the businesses that we deal with in Asia are small to medium size enterprises, and operating in environments where there's actually the rule of law and the quality of regulation is actually often rather low. And that's where corporate governance really counts. And there's some great companies, really, really well-run companies in our part of the world that really flourish on the fact that they run themselves very, very well in difficult circumstances.
Thank you, Steve. I think that was an excellent way to close on that very positive thing that we can do and that we can start to think about operationalizing that across the organizations that we work in or that we lead. With that, I'd really like to say thank you to the panel. First to Gareth for really setting up a fantastic scene of which we could pick at and build the conversation. So thank you, Gareth, for your keynote and your participation. Thank you, Prue, for joining us in Australia. And thank you, Steve, of course, for being the sidekick here for me. It's always nice to have a friendly face on the panel. So with that, perhaps I could hand to Victor with any closing remarks that, Victor, you would like to share.
Thank you very much, Pam, and my thanks to Prue, Gareth, and Steve for a really great panel conversation, and to you, Pam, for expert moderation and a great summary. I think good decisions rest on good governance, and the panel has talked about the various different threads of what that means, including diversity of thinking, diversity of experience and perspective, diversity of gender on boards. And also what came through for me very, very strongly is honesty and integrity of intent, of action, and of communication. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank the audience for your attention. We've really enjoyed these 3 webinars, one each on ESG, and want to continue with the willingness of all 3 companies, this collaboration, because it really has been remarkably effective and impactful in a positive way. So my thanks to all of you for your time and expertise once again. My thanks to your companies for engaging with us. And we look forward to more great, positive, impactful work in the future. So from all of us at SICC, I just leave you with a slide on thank you. If there's anything we can do to help, just drop us a line to here to help at sicc.com.sg. And that includes if you've got ideas for topics, themes, activities that you think we should be providing you and we're not. Always keen to try and see if we can plug any gaps. And of course, always keen for those of you who are not members to become members. You can find out more on our website or just drop us a line to membership@sicc.com.sg. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, for inviting us.
You're most welcome.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.